Cool. We are live. Good day, morning, afternoon, evening, whatever. Welcome to Open+Sec. I am Ali, and I'm with your boy 24. You already know who he is. He doesn't need any introduction. And we'll be talking about open source security. The opportunities, challenges, and potentially risks as well, and also how you can get involved. And we'll also be talking a bit about what Open+Sec is and what we're trying to achieve. So just a little bit of background. I come from a background of software engineering, and I developed, lots of products, mobile applications, web, front end, back ends, and I have built some startups along the way as well. So I kind of have the organization's perspective. I have the software developer's perspective, but also after transitioning into a cybersecurity career, um, I also have the security perspective as well. And currently, I run Pheasant as a co-founder, which is an accessible security company. I'm also a co-founder of Black, which is a non-profit supporting Black people in cybersecurity. And I also work as a security engineer focusing on application security. And yeah, I'm really excited about this. 24, can you give a brief background of yourself?
All right, good. You already integrated and this covers the 30 time zone of where you're watching from. My name is 24. I'm the manager at Science currently. I also lead some developer communities from here in Nigeria, Kwara State to be very precise. My background is more of a community perspective, how security education, been involved in a lot of security awareness campaigns, trainings, depending on cut across different categories of sectors, uh, NDAs, schools, secondary school students, talked about security with some SMEs as well. So I am more of a community guy. So because I like to find ways to now make impact to the community perspective, security wise, and at the same time, I find joy when I help people. So now delving into open source security was more of what's that one challenge that people have, especially from this part of the world. One challenge that people have, or one challenge that people, a sector that people do not really have more understanding on. So how can we make people or the enthusiasts from the whole cybersecurity community benefit more from this and the whole developer security issues? Because at the end of the day, developers cause issues for security guys because most of the time, just because they do not have basic training or basic understanding of what are the methodologies, what is even the SDLC, and just with getting people or educating developers rather at the same time increasing the cybersecurity guys and knowledge about open source will open more opportunity for us from this part of the world, obviously. So Open+Sec is just it's not just an initiative or a movement right now. So that's enough about me and why we're doing this. So along the line, we still talk more about Open+ security, but for now, I think we should just go straight into it.
Yeah, and I think the community aspect is super, super important because, no matter how much technical knowledge you've amassed, no matter how much, um, no matter what kind of solutions you're building, you still need the people that are going to benefit from that solution, people that are going to contribute to making that solution better. So yeah, I mean, community is uh, just as important as the technical stuff as well. So yeah, what is open source? Like what exactly is open source? To me, open source is software that allows you to see the source code. Right, the source code is freely available on online. It could be on GitHub, GitLab, or anywhere really. That's pretty much it. It's free to use. Um, I mean, there are different licensing structures with open source, which we're going to get to. But yeah, to me, that's basically what open source is. 24. Any additional thoughts?
Yeah. So now, the first thing that comes to mind when you say something is open source, it means it is built on a community or by a community rather. So the first thing is obviously you mentioned it is free and it is accessible to almost everyone, and you can play around with it in a way that you feel I think this is better for me. But at the same time, uh, open source I think is one of the most used tools globally because not many people can afford some paid proprietary softwares. So, and for every proprietary software that is out there, there's almost an equal or even more better alternative, which is free for the community. So yeah, that's open source from my own end.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And if you don't know it yet, you're most definitely using open source technologies right now. Right. Mozilla Firefox, the web browser, and basically almost every other Mozilla product is is open source. And we're talking about things like, I think the most popular example is the Linux kernel, which forms the basis of you know different flavors of Linux operating systems. It forms the basis of Android devices, your smart TVs, but most importantly, web servers. Um, Huge majority of web servers run on Linux, regardless of who you are or where you are. Like you're using directly or indirectly using open source technology. And a lot of these things wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for open source. If it was just one organization trying to build all these things on their own, it wouldn't be as good. It might not even be possible to get to where we are now. Um, and of course, there's like even proprietary software that is closed source and maybe even paid. They use open source um, software as well, like libraries and things like that in their own software as well. I mean, if you go to any mobile application, you go deep into the settings, you might find somewhere where they talk about licenses or something like open source software, where they list all the third party libraries that they've used. Because yeah, some open source licenses require you to give credits where credit is due. I mean, can't blame them for that. So, 24. How do organizations currently use open source software?
Organizations basically, just like you mentioned, saying from now from maybe the server side point of view, but use themselves might not even be using an open source product or an open source project or software for their daily routines. But some of their servers are built on open source, are built on open source. So they basically more or less, I think you almost cannot run away from it because it is it is meant to, or it is called the most secured. People tend to say, okay, open source is more secure than some of these proprietary softwares, just because you have more people looking at it. You have you have the opportunity to also look at the source code and even figure out what is wrong with it. Continuous monitoring is one of those things that people tend to maybe fail from. So the over reliance of open source software from organization's point of view is very, very high, except for organizations that kind of like know more of what they do. So they do not necessarily 100% depend on those open source software and depend on the community to solve the open source problems. Because at the end of the day, because many people are looking at it, some people might not even uh, figure out, okay, is this even a vulnerability? How do you even identify if this is even a vulnerability? And it might even be a small thing that you just count as this is just norms, or somebody else will take it up. But from an organization's point of view, I feel the same way you have a security team managing your proprietary softwares or whatever products you're using is the same way you should approach an open source tool or an open source project as well. So organizations use open source tool like almost every day.
Yeah, and I think there are different ways that they use the open source software. Um, for instance, it could be an application that you just download and use. You might not even be interacting with the source code element itself. Um, I'll give you an example. So there's this tool called Postman. You probably heard of it. It's for like API testing and stuff like that. Really powerful tool. It allows you to like manage different collections of APIs and um, collaborate when testing. But they started, you know, becoming more and more and more commercial. It's not open source, by the way. So they started, even though you can still use a free version, but they started having, things where you have to create an account. They'll start nudging you to create an account. Might be sending, and it might be sending like automatically uploading your API collections to their cloud, which is what you don't want. If you're an organization that's just using Postman, you don't have like an enterprise license. Your developers are just using the free version, and they believe they're using it locally. Well, when you realize that they've made an update that kind of forces that cloud upload, what do you do then? You typically, when you're using software that you just download and agree to their terms of service, you don't usually have as many guarantees as, say, if you entered into some kind of enterprise agreement where your legal department looks at the contract, they sign, and then the vendor also signs. You don't have that if you're just downloading the software and using it. So obviously, you wouldn't want like internal data to be shared to that kind of cloud where you don't have the visibility, you don't have that legal protection that comes with an enterprise deal. So what lots of organizations did is they found an open source alternative called Bruno. And it's not as powerful as Postman is yet, but it can do basically almost everything that Postman can do. And so we just migrated to Bruno. And good thing is Bruno is compatible with Postman collections as well. So if you have existing Postman collections, you could just import it. And yeah, that was really, really cool. Like the fact that there was an open source alternative that personally I hadn't even heard about it. It was one of our software engineers that said, yeah, we can just use Bruno, guys. We don't have to worry about Postman or anything like that. And that was really cool. So there's, open source software that you can just download and use. So there's other ones like libraries that are integrated into the software that organizations are trying to develop. So like no software is actually built up from complete scratch. Like if you're developing software, you are definitely using open source. Whether it's the framework that your software is built on, or whether it's just little libraries that you are integrating to handle certain like very common functionality. You're not trying to reinvent the wheel every single time, right? Imagine if you're trying to build a car and then you're trying to assemble every single little component yourself. It's going to take you forever to build that car. But if you're focusing on, okay, what do I want my car to be good at? I'm trying to build like a better engine, for instance, or maybe might be something like I'm trying to build a good user experience with the car, right? I'm trying to make it as user friendly as possible. Focus on solving that problem and then outsource the wheels, the side mirror. Like you're not trying to build every single component yourself. So that's kind of an analogy for how open source software integrates into um, software development life cycles. So 24, what what are the security challenges of open source that you've seen? I mean, yes, open source doesn't mean like it's insecure by default, right? Just because the code is out there out in the open doesn't mean it's less secure. It can mean it's more secure because, like you said, there's a whole community looking at that code. Anybody can just go and investigate, look at it, and report any security problems. But yeah, it every everything has its challenges, right? So what are the security challenges you've seen with open source?
If you look at it from the software engineer's point or the engineering point, of the basic understanding of attack vectors, because if you look at some of these engineers, they just code and just go straight into just writing now whatever it is that they are very, very conversant with or whatever it is that they're comfortable with. And because it is an open source tool or it is an open source project, let's say there is this misconception about C being the most vulnerable language or the most language, it has a lot of language specific vulnerabilities. And why? Because now, okay, let's say now this developer understands C much better and uses C to just write code and just do some specific things on the tool. If the maintainer themselves do not even have the understanding, say, okay, this is something that might cause us a problem in the future, they just approve and just let it slide. Why? Because obviously it is an improvement. And because it is said that the community can contribute to it. So basic understanding of the attack vectors to use techniques like stride technique to model out what are even the vulnerabilities or what are identify risk. How do you identify risk and how do you reduce this risk? So who is this raises the question, who is managing or trying to find risk in a particular open source tool? There are some open source organizations or open source teams that are out there to be like the cyber police or the open source police. I think I've seen, is it Project Open something? I've seen it one time. So what they do is they just basically find vulnerabilities in open source tools and try to say it out and just tell people about it. So the whole ecosystem, is built on, it just contributes to it, not minding, okay, let's even find these vulnerabilities because I think the most common vulnerabilities are SQL injection, process scripting, and all of those things of overflows. So if you look at it, basic understanding basic understanding would help in making sure that these things really do not ever happen. Thing that causes or uh, that brings about that bridges this gap is communication. Because there is a lot of people collaborating or contributing to this, how do you now prevent miscommunication in terms of, okay, we have the documentation up. How do you now say, okay, is that documentation 100% reliable to say, okay, it has all the information anybody needs to even know how to even use that particular tool in the first place before it now gets to the point of, say, the developer, how do that contribute to it, or how do you, it's, and again, when I say about developers, it looks as if it's only developers that can contribute to an open source tool. No, basically, anybody can contribute to it, even from design. I have a friend who contributed to it, the UX of a particular product. So communication aspect has to be improved or has to be worked on, and something that has to be continuous. It has to be continuous in terms of being able to approach this thing in a long term. How do you provide all the necessary communication, all the necessary documentations for everybody to, first of all, know how to use them, second, know how to contribute, and just being able to identify, okay, what are the common risks and what are the common risks and what do you do to make sure that you are not into things. So it has to be out there, and I believe there are maintainers for every particular project. But because this thing is more of a voluntary activity or act of service, so that responsibility to treat an open source tool the way you treat a proprietary software that you have been paid for or you have been paid to manage is not there. So being responsible for a particular product or a particular tool has to be something that yeah I believe we need to work on. Just basically being accountable. Developers will feel a sense of ownership are more likely to produce a secure and reliable code, not because um, not because they are good or they are bad, but because they know that's okay. I should be accountable for this thing that I'm doing, and I should be proud to come out there to say, okay, I contributed to this particular project or projects rather, because by the time your name is out there saying you contributed to a particular project, and that project uh, turns out to have a very very silly uh, vulnerability, something that could be avoided. It turns out that your name now is being dragged in the mud. So that sense of responsibility and just being able to being able to take account for whatever it is they're doing. Those are those are more soft skills or the soft side of what a contributor has to embed in themselves. As much as the hard skills are very important, so is the soft skills. So yeah, that's kind of like most of the most common incidents of vulnerabilities that was affected with open source.
Yeah. um, the it's quite complex in terms of the different types of security challenges that you find in uh, open source products. I mean, I think at the end of the day, vulnerabilities are inevitable in any kind of software, open source included. But the challenge is when you're implementing um, open source software. Let's say you're developing software and you have some open source dependencies, things that your own software is using or taking advantage of. If there's any vulnerability in that third party or open source software, then that also affects your own project. But that's not where it ends. Um, the open source third party libraries that you are using might also have their uh, other dependencies, and those dependencies also have other dependencies, and those dependencies have more dependencies. So a vulnerability that is in a dependency of a dependency of a dependency of a dependency can end up affecting you, right? It's like if you've ever tried to develop develop an application using Node.js, there's a meme around like Node modules, like just create a new project and just see all the modules that have already been installed. You've not added anything. You're just using Node, but all the modules that Node installs by default, it's already a lot. And yeah, that's one of the challenges. That's one of the things that you have to deal with. And I think that's why things like secure composition analysis is important, where it automatically scans your dependencies and the dependencies of your dependencies, scans the entire dependency tree for any known vulnerabilities, like vulnerabilities that have already been disclosed So that way you can stay on top of like, how vulnerable your project is from an open source perspective. And I think that takes me to, how do you even choose which open source projects to use? Whether it's as a software that you just download and use yourself, or a third party component. You have to look at like the project health, like how many people are contributing to it, how often do they roll out updates. Because again, if the last time it was updated was 2 years ago, then you might not want to like, you might not want to look at that project, especially if it's, you're working using that to build your own software. So how often do they maintain it? Because again, vulnerabilities are inevitable, but when those vulnerabilities are discovered, how quickly would the maintainers be able to solve those vulnerabilities? So you have to look at how often how well it's maintained, how many issues have been raised, and how quickly are these issues addressed? How many people are contributing to the project? If a project has 700 contributors, that's a very good sign, because it means lots of people are invested enough in that project to actually go and contribute. So yeah, those are the challenges I've seen, and I guess how we can try to address them. I
Well,
think okay,
yeah, but if you look at knowing how to or knowing what tool to use,
yeah,
if you some people take these things very, very lightly, or maybe because me, I love using Google. So the news section of Google gives you a very detailed information about a particular tool. That's if it is out there. But no matter what, there'll always be something out there about it too. If you go on Twitter, if you go on some of these forums, or the Stack Overflow or Reddit, you'll
yeah,
see information about a particular tool, especially if it is a problem or if it is a vulnerability. Somebody out there might have mentioned it. It might not be a properly reported vulnerability, but a mere tweeting about it is an addition. When you go out there to say, okay, now let me just, for example, let's say this pen is one of a tool. I don't want to call it a tool right now. So, and because you want to find vulnerabilities in this pen, you just basically go on Google, go to the news section, just Google in pen or type in recent vulnerability or recent incident about pen. And from there, you cannot even streamline your scope into Twitter or Reddit. Those two platforms are very, 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 very helpful in terms of giving out updates about a particular thing, especially if it's something that is causing a lot of problem. So somebody out there would have complained about it, and you try to see, okay, now how recent was that complaint, and was it attended to? Then you try to check it out on your own while using that particular tool. So that's another one.
yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah, and very good source of like reviews, just people having conversations talking about certain tools and certain products. Yeah, people talk a lot on Twitter or Reddit, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit more about Open+Sec. Um, what is it that we're trying to do? Like, why? And why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve here? You want me to go first?
Yeah, please go first. Then I'll just talk
All
about
right, that's fine. So with Open+Sec, uh, as the name implies, and because we've been talking about open source security all this while, it's all about open source security. It's all about raising more awareness about open source security. Um, you know, in terms of what the challenges are, what are the current trends, how do you um, how do you stay secure when using open source? How do you leverage open source security, open source tools in a secure way? But also talking about open source security tools. So security tools that are open source that you can use, you know, like 24 said earlier, almost any software or tool out there has an open source alternative. So, for instance, let's say you're trying to practice your skills and you can't afford like commercial software. You can take advantage of the open source alternatives of that software to try and hone your skills in that particular technology. Like it could be same tool, it could be firewalls, it could be anything really. So we're going to be diving into all these uh, security tools that are open source. We're going to be diving into how to contribute to open source as well. And again, as I said earlier, it's not limited to code contributions. You don't have to be a programmer to contribute to open source. You might be able to contribute to the documentation, advocacy, or maybe you're using the software and you find some issues. You might can contribute by raising issues and suggesting improvements. Documentation is actually very, very important and very underrated when it comes to open source. Like I've tried to use lots of open source tools myself, and sometimes it's just like the documentation isn't always up to date, or it doesn't cover enough information for someone that's a total beginner. Right? Like the documentation might work fine, perfectly fine for someone who's been using that tool for a while, or the people who have contributed to the code themselves because they already know the ins and outs of that software. But for someone who's a completely new beginner to that tool or to that software, the documentation might just not be enough. And for you as someone who did not contribute to that code, you have like that fresh perspective of okay, I'm just getting into this, I'm reading the documentation, following it step by step. Oh, there's a problem here. You can raise those issues to help create like better documentation. If there's any gaps there. And also like promoting uh the use of open source technologies within the security community as well. That's something that we're trying to achieve with this. So yeah, it's quite exciting. I mean, this is something that I've been wanting to do for quite some time now. Yeah, here we are doing it. Is there anything you want to add?
Looking at open source, because we believe that almost just because many organizations use open source tools, and at the same time, you might not even have, let's say, developers do not have the basic understanding of security. Some developers might not have the basic understanding of security or what needs to be put in place. Those little trainings, um, education, obviously, Charlie has mentioned. So the target audience for Open+Sec is basically the two categories of this field. You coming from a security by a professional or you being a developer. So we tend to now be in the middle, man in the middle for this to now bridge the gap for especially knowledge and pushing for more contributors and pushing for more people to we ourselves can even bring up a particular tool to say, okay, now let's review this tool. Obviously, let's review this tool and point out what is not there and what needs to be there. And basically, picking out the problem is not enough, or rather making recommendations about that particular problem. So it's not even enough to even say, okay, I mean, they're just making recommendations, but actually providing the solution to say, okay, now let's take it upon ourselves. So now even do the solutions or to provide the solutions for those particular problems. So yeah, and if you look at globally, open source is not a new thing. Globally, not a new thing. But if you look at it from Africa, it's not really new, but it's not well known to an extent, or you don't have more people jumping on it. From the security point of view, to get me correctly, from the security point of view, everybody uses open source. But from the security point of view, not many people are out there securing it or taking it upon themselves to say, okay, now let me even go into this. Of course, there are bug bounties for mostly proprietary softwares or tools rather, or are there bug bounties for some of these things? There might be, but yeah, just making them well known and to say, okay, now yeah, you can try to find these things and the reward might not be monetary because obviously it is free and it's more of it's contributed from by the community, so obviously free. So some of these things can go as far as just making sure that people are happy and giving them something to just own to say, okay, yeah, being a star that I contributed to something like this and be recognized as a contributor or as a protector rather from the security point of view. It's another thing that we can also follow. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for adding that additional context. And now you can see why the community side of things is super important. Um, yeah, for now we're just starting with having these discussions around open source security. We're going to be talking about like latest trends, like things that are happening around the open source security world. Um, so things like any recent vulnerabilities that have been found, we're going to be breaking down and discussing them. Any open source tools that would benefit someone from a security perspective, we're going to be talking about them. So anything that's really happening in the security world of from an open source perspective, we're going to be discussing them here. And in the coming weeks, you might see us pushing out more discussions like this, more stuff like articles and things like that. And yeah, it's quite exciting. Oh, one other thing I didn't mention is we're going to be building open source software ourselves. So like um building like basic tools or basic software to kind of demonstrate to our viewers or listeners how this stuff works. And we're also going to be looking at like as we're developing these tools, we're going to be looking at security implications of the things that we're developing. We're going to be breaking down the different components, the back end, front end, and stuff like that. We're also going to be looking at uh, AI applications and how they can be secure. Because I mean, we have lots of like open source language models, open source applications. In fact, just yesterday I started installing Agent GPT, something like that. I installed it and I'm not 100% sure about the name. It's basically just like Auto GPT. It's a software that allows you to use GPT like but on steroids. Like you're able to use it as an agent, not just like a chat conversation. So it can like take actions on your behalf. Yeah, should be fun experimenting with that one. So we're going to look at stuff like that, try to use them and try to discuss like what are the security implications and how can you take advantage of this software yourself. But of course in a more secure manner. So I think one other thing that we wanted to talk about today, just before we close off, is how to contribute to open source. Or I think we already discussed that. 24, is there anything else you want to discuss before we close out the session?
I think it's almost an hour already. So for more context, I think how to even contribute to open source. We can I believe let's talk about that in depth because that's a very, very deep conversations on its own, which needs we might even need to even share our screen to show an example of how to do some of these things. Because obviously people do not even understand. Because first of all, when you go most of this just to on GitHub. So when you go to GitHub, because you're not a developer, you not get confused about the whole interface. Um, maybe because because you're not very familiar with the particular platform. One, so how do you recognize how to even search? You have searched, you have gotten a particular tool, you know, to read me, like to check the documentation. That's the documentation about that particular tool. Then now going forward to see, okay, now I want to contribute to this thing. Maybe improve the documentation. How do I go about it? How do I even start? That's a challenge that even I faced. So we should do that on the next one. So for our listeners with long talk, so it's maybe 1 hour. It's fine. So yeah, that's for my own point of view. So I think we should just do the how to document or how to contribute to open source as a security professional uh, perspective on the next one. So yeah, you've gotten the next topic of discussion. Most people would want to uh, look out for it. Why? Because it is a very, very interesting and common topic, how to contribute. We have a lot of cybersecurity professionals, even within the community. Many of them are very conversant with open source security protection. So yeah, that should be on the next one.
Cool. We have our next topic, how to contribute to open source. Well, this has been a very good discussion and a really good way to open up the uh, conversation and the work that we're going to be doing at Open+Sec. And thank you for listening. Thank you for watching this. Really drop any thoughts, any thoughts or comments that you have or feedback. Is there anything that we missed? Is there anything that you want us to discuss in future sessions? Drop that in the comments. Wherever you're watching this, um, reach out, tell us what you're thinking. And yeah, I guess we'll see you next week.
Definitely. We'll see you next week. So you are the community. So your comments, really matter in building this. We are just the face here, but it's something that we are all involved in. So it's a movement that everybody in the field has to contribute to one way or the other. Yeah, thank you very much for listening from my own end. See you guys again. I'll see you guys again next week or next one rather.
Yes.